The form came through on a Tuesday, which is how I remember it. Not because Tuesdays were unusual, because I had just cleared a backlog of 412 intake packets from the Vithara cluster survey, and I was feeling for the first time in weeks that the work was manageable. I was wrong about that. The Galactic Biological Registry intake form has 47 fields. 31 are mandatory. The rest are conditional, filled only when the relevant biological characteristic is present in the subject species. I had processed 11,214 forms before the human packet arrived on my station. I knew the form the way a mason knows a particular tool, the weight of it, the grain, the places where it sat easily, and the places where it resisted. Version notation is field 36, conditional, not mandatory, but in 6 years of processing, I had never once seen it left blank. Every species with a version notation had one. Every species without the characteristic was flagged with the standard non-applicable code, NCA Bio. The system auto-populated. When the biological scan came back negative, it was never simply blank. Field was never simply empty and unsignaled. The human form had no NCABO code. The field was blank. I stared at it for longer than I should have. The rest of the form was complete: species designation, origin system, atmospheric tolerances, cellular structure summary, reproductive classification, all 31 mandatory fields, and 14 of the conditionals. Clean work. The scanning team had been thorough. But field 36 sat empty, and the intake system had not flagged it as an error, which meant whoever submitted the packet had not flagged it either. The blank had traveled all the way from the survey vessel to the Vithara Academy's taxonomy wing without anyone marking it as a problem. I marked it as a problem. Correction requests at our level go to the senior taxonomist. Orvin Det had held his post for 31 years. He was not a man who enjoyed being interrupted for what he considered administrative noise, and in my first year at the academy, I had learned to bring him only the corrections that genuinely could not wait. I brought him this one. He looked at the form for perhaps 2 seconds. "Rerun the biological scan request," he said. "Survey vessel may have submitted an incomplete packet." "I already reran it," I said. "The scan itself is complete. The version notation field is blank on the scan return." He looked at me, then back at the form, then at me again. Something shifted in his expression, not alarm, not confusion. Something slower than either of those things. "File it as received," he said. "I'll review it." That should have been the end of it. I had done my job, escalated correctly, and been told to move on. I moved on. I cleared 14 more packets that afternoon. 2 from the outer Solvith corridor, a batch of 6 from the Dravathi border region, 6 more from an independent survey. And I did not think about the human form again until the following morning, when I pulled the archive index to cross-check my filing sequence and found that the human record was not the only one. There were more, 2 or 3 more, not a dozen. I ran the search 3 times before I accepted what I was seeing. Every human intake form in the Academy archive, going back to the first contact survey 6 years prior, had the same blank in field 36. 8 forms total, 48 blank version notation fields, not one NCA bio code among them. Not one notation from a senior reviewer explaining the gap, just the blank repeated and filed, and stacked in the archive alongside 11,000 species that all had something written there. I pulled the earliest human form in the stack. The filing date was 6 years, 2 months, and 17 days before my current processing cycle. The taxonomist who had filed it was not Orvin Det. He had only taken the senior post 3 years back. The taxonomist who had originally filed it was a woman named Thesson Vell, who had retired before I arrived at the academy. Her remarks field on that first form contained a single line. Scan return no result. Field submitted as received. Query pending. Query had never been closed. I checked, because I wanted to be sure. The Academy's query management system logs every open correction request by filing date. Query Thesson Vell had opened 6 years, and 2 months ago was still listed as active, which meant it had survived 2 senior taxonomist transitions, 3 system migrations, and the Academy's general records audit conducted 18 months before my appointment. Nobody had touched it. It sat there in the queue, between a disputed subspecies classification from the Vithara cluster, which had been resolved in the 3rd month of my tenure, and a scan quality complaint from a deep-range survey vessel, which had been closed without action 2 years prior. The human query sat between those two resolved items, like something the system had simply decided to work around. I brought this to Orvandet. I had printed the index, the list of all 48 forms, with their filing time dates and the blank field visible on each one. I set it on his desk and waited while he looked at it. He was quiet for a long time. "The version notation field," I said, because someone had to say something, "is the biological indicator for species developmental stage. It tells us whether the subject population has reached its terminal form or whether further physiological iteration is expected. We use it to project long-term population stability, resource modeling, cultural extrapolation. Every species in the archive has one. Some have versions going back to their pre-sapiens records. Humans have 48 blank fields." "I am aware of what the field indicates," Orvandet said. "Then why is it blank?" "Because the scan came back with no result. That's what Thessenville wrote 6 years ago. Query she flagged is still open. In 6 years of continued contact and survey, no one has closed it. No one has rerun the underlying analysis. And the field has stayed blank on every subsequent form. That is not a pending result. That is a pattern." Orvandet stood up. That was unusual. He was not a man who stood for administrative discussions. He walked to the window, the wide, south-facing panel that looked out over the academy's lower courtyard. And he stood with his back to me for a moment that ran longer than was comfortable. He was not a man who stood for administrative discussions. He walked to the window, the wide, south-facing panel that looked out over the academy's lower courtyard, and he stood with his back to me for a moment that ran longer than was comfortable. "Pull the field documentation," he said, "for field 36, not the intake form documentation, the original registry documentation. Field-level notes. They are in the founding archive, pre-digital, 5th sublevel of the East Stack. I spent the better part of 2 hours in the East Stack. The founding archive at Cathara predates the digital catalog by roughly 400 years, and the field-level documentation for the version notation field was a physical record. Thin sheets of compressed material, bound in a casing that had darkened with age but held its structure. The field had been established during the second expansion period, when the registry had been formalized across the current galactic member states. The documentation ran to 11 pages of procedural definition, usage notes, and amendment records. I read the 11 pages before I found the amendments. Procedural definition was standard. A field to capture the developmental stage classification, as returned by the biological scan, cross-referenced with the species historical survey record, to determine whether the current form represented a stable terminal expression or an intermediate state. The usage notes described how to handle borderline cases, how to weight conflicting scan data, how to classify species that had been in apparent developmental plateau for extended periods. It was careful, detailed work, the kind of documentations written by people who expected the field to remain in use indefinitely. The amendments were the part I had not expected. There were 4 of them. The first 3 were routine, minor clarifications to the scanning protocol, a revised threshold for the developmental plateau classification, an updated cross-reference to the reproductive classification field. The 4th amendment was dated approximately 112 years after the registry's founding. It was shorter than the others. It was also the only one written, not in standard registry notation, but in a plain declarative hand, as if whoever had drafted it had not wanted to dress it in procedure. The amendment read, "Field 36, version notation, human species, Sol system, 3rd planet. Scanning teams have returned consistent null results for this field across 3 independent survey cycles. Consultation with human representatives was undertaken. The following is recorded for the registry's institutional memory. Human representatives stated that they are aware of the field's purpose. They stated that they understand what a version notation implies. A current circuitus in a developmental sequence that is not yet complete, position in a progression toward a terminal form. They stated that they do not accept the premise. They do not have a version because they are not progressing toward a fixed terminal form. They have declined to have the field completed. This amendment instructs all subsequent intake clerks. Do not attempt to complete field 36 for human subjects. The field is to be submitted blank. The subjects are aware of the field and have declined. I read it twice. Then I sat down on the floor of the east stack between the shelves because my legs had decided that standing was no longer a reasonable request. They knew what the field meant. They had been asked, directly, in consultation, and they had understood, and they had said no. Not no, we don't have a version. Not no, the scan is incorrect. No, we do not accept the premise that we are progressing toward a fixed form. No, we will not be cataloged as a work in progress toward something finished. No, do not fill that field. For 112 years, the field had sat blank across every human form in the registry, and the note explaining why had been filed in a physical archive on the 5th sublevel of the east stack, and every intake clerk who had processed a human form in that time had either never found the note or had decided that the blank was simply an ongoing scan error, pending resolution. I brought the document to Orvandet. He read it at his desk. He read it the way I had read it, twice, without moving. Then he set it down and looked at the surface of his desk for a moment, as if the desk had something to say. You'll file the note in the digital record, he said. Attach it to all 48 human intake forms as an explanatory annotation. Flag the version notation field across all of them as closed, not pending, not error, or closed, with reference to the amendment. Closed, I said. Not applicable. Not applicable, he said. Closed, there is a difference. Not applicable means the characteristic is absent. Closed means the field was considered and a determination was made. The determination being that the humans declined. Yes. I went back to my station. I made the annotations. I updated all 48 records. I flagged the field as closed on each one and attached the amendment as the explanatory document, which meant that anyone who pulled a human intake form from that point forward would see, in field 36, not a blank and not an NCABIO code, a closed notation pointing back to a 112-year-old amendment that said, the subjects are aware of the field and have declined. When I finished, I sat for a while. The version notation field tells you where a species is in its journey. It tells you what they are now, and it implies, gently, in the language of biological taxonomy, that what they are now is not quite what they will eventually be. Every species in the archive has accepted that framing without comment. They are at a stage. They are progressing. They have a version. The humans had read the form, understood the question, and declined to answer it. Not because they lacked a current form, not because the scan was defective, because they looked at the field and recognized what it was asking them to be. A step on a staircase, a draft before a final version, and they had said quietly and apparently without much drama that they did not see themselves that way. One field, 7 on the form, 31 mandatory. One blank that had sat in the archive for over a century, filed and refiled and never resolved, because the resolution was there in the east stack the whole time, and the resolution was not a scan result. The resolution was a refusal. I have processed 417 more human forms since then. Field 36 on every one of them closes automatically now, pointing to the amendment. I no longer have to think about it. But sometimes, when a new packet comes through and I open the form to the first field and work my way down, I still pause for a moment at 36. Because it surprises me. Because it doesn't anymore. That's the part that stays with me.